One of the Titanic's most gallant passengers was Benjamin Guggenheim. As the last lifeboats were leaving the ship, Guggenheim appeared on deck, accompanied by his valet. He was resplendent in white tie and tails. "We are dressed in our best," he observed calmly, "and prepared to go down like gentlemen." Dressing up for a special occasion was an Edwardian ritual ashore, and it made sense to extend it to shipboard life as well. And we do the same by dressing for meals in the evening. After all, it makes good sense, for overeating has always been the transatlantic passenger's favorite sport. In fact, some of them were advised never to eat anything they couldn't lift. Now, in my next program, we'll discuss Kaiser Wilhelm's favorite ship, and we'll also have a look at life on board during the 20s. But now, I see it's time for me to go down to dinner dressed in my best. Essentials of an ocean voyage anywhere is this neat, compact space we call a cabin. There are 1,000 of them on the Norway, and as in every cabin in which I've ever sailed, there's something distinctive about each and every one of them. Someone once said of their cabin on the Aquitania that it smelled of 3 things: soap, flowers, and the sea. With air conditioning, we can no longer open the portholes, so the sea smell is gone. But evocative sounds remain, the tremor of the turbines below, as well as the restless murmuring of the ship as she sails through the ocean. I'm very pleased that the cabins on the Norway have bunks and portholes. Some time ago in our story, there was a shipping man who wanted to abolish them because he felt they were old-fashioned. That was in 1912, and the shipping man in question was Albert Berlin, head of Germany's Hamburg America line. He was very envious of the White Star Line and wanted his ships to be as splendid as those of his British rivals. So he banished from all cabins all bunks and portholes, substituting in their place brass beds and interior window casements. In the process, he reduced his cabins to the anonymous banality of hotel rooms. Now, ships are not merely floating hotels for 2 very good reasons. First, hotels only cater to one class of visitor, whereas ships accommodate rich and poor alike. Secondly, once a crossing had begun, there was no possible way you could check out. Keeping this distinction firmly in mind, let us see how the ships of the Hamburg America line were built. Only 2 months after the Titanic went down, an even larger vessel was launched across the North Sea. She was Kaiser Wilhelm II's favorite ship, perhaps because her name, the Imperator, means emperor in Latin. He exhibited a great personal interest in her construction, the first of a new class, and, astonishingly enough, the first superliner to be built in Germany. Prior to that time, German shipping companies went shopping for their vessels in Britain, usually to Harland and Wolff. For the Hamburg shipwrights to have produced a trio of 50,000 tonners within the space of 2 years was a formidable achievement. The Imperator was the first of a trio of Imperator-class ships. Her 2 successive sisters would be called Vaterland and Bismarck. The Kaiser was to christen the Imperator, and whereas the Duchess of Roxbury had stood on a sloping platform under the bows of the Mauretania, a special 2-story launch structure was built for His Majesty. On launch day, the Kaiser must have been rather out of breath, having clambered up to the first level, shaken hands with all the silk hats and spiked helmets, before clambering up to the little cupola above, in company with Albert Berlin, head of the Hamburg America line. 2 embarrassing incidents occurred that day. First, a piece of scaffolding fell from the bow, nearly hitting the Kaiser. For a moment it seemed that he had been struck, but he had merely leapt back out of the way. A few moments later, he pushed the launch button. A bottle of Moselle, not champagne, swung down on the end of a long steel arm and shattered against the Imperator's stem. The hull began to move. To prevent her from ramming the opposite side of the harbor, the anchors were poised. Once she was off the ways, both were let go quite literally, for someone had forgotten to secure the onboard ends, and both anchors and several fathoms of valuable anchor cable rattled down into the mud of Hamburg harbor. But at least the Imperator was afloat. For a year she was fitted out. Once her double hull was complete, Hamburg's largest fire pumper was loaded on board by crane, so that the space between the two skins could be tested by filling it with water. A new anchor came on board, as well as 6 huge turbines, 4 forward and 2 astern, that had been made in Germany under license from Charles Parsons. 3 enormous funnels, the tallest of their day, were erected atop the sun deck. At the end of the year, she was dry docked to have her rudder installed. When she was completed and ready for trials, she was at once refined, elegant, although somehow cumbersome. On her bow was a preposterous ornament, a scowling eagle, its wings outstretched, its talons gripping a globe on which was inscribed, "Mein Feld ist die Welt," "My field is the world," the motto of the Hamburg America line. It was placed atop a vertical stem, quite clearly without any aesthetic provision having been made to receive it. All the Imperator's eagle accomplished in reality was to lengthen the ship by a critical 18 feet, making it longer than Cunard's Aquitania, fitting out at John Brown's yard on the Clyde. Ship owners were intent on having the longest, if not the fastest ship in the world. Another view of the infamous bird at Hoboken reveals a distressing peculiarity about the Kaiser's favorite ship, with far more serious consequences. She listed terribly, or in the delicate prose of the naval architect, was deficient in initial stability. From the moment she first arrived in New York harbor, the New York pilots christened her the Limperator. With her bunkers depleted near Crossing's End, and with a breeze on her vast flank, the new German liner leaned alarmingly away from the vertical. This happened simply because Charles Mevez, the Hamburg America's resident architect, had provided such lavish interiors. Low down in the ship was the celebrated Pompeian bath, which he had copied from one he had designed for London's Royal Automobile Club in 1910. It was a monumental fixture, yet located on the lowest deck, its mosaic and marble columns made little difference to problems of stability. The double-decker dining room, huge but restrained, was similarly located well down in the hull. But up on B deck, devoted entirely to stupendous public rooms, Mevez had gone drastically over budget in terms of top weight. The main lounge, or social hall, for the first class was 27 feet high, executed in handsome Louis XVI style. Further forward was the winter garden, and up a flight of marble steps, a lavish extra-tariff restaurant, the Ritz-Carlton. This was an innovation that Mevez and Albert Ballin had perfected on the America 7 years earlier, a restaurant where first-class passengers could book meals at any hour of the day they chose, paying for the privilege. On the America, the Ritz-Carlton had been a special little room tucked out of sight on an upper deck. On the Imperator, the concept was enlarged, and the room featured decoration that raised havoc with the ship's stability. Further aft, the smoking room's real brick-and-mortar fireplace added to stability problems. Even in the most private of rooms, inch-thick marble backsplash, a tub as hefty as a tank, and a toilet that seemed large enough for a bathtub in the second class, all added their own crushing weight. It was all this embarras de richesse that made the Imperator into the Limperator. After her first season, during annual dry docking, several modifications were made. Here at Cuxhaven, the profile was indelibly changed. 9 feet have come off the tops of each funnel, and below decks 2,000 tons of cement were poured into the bilges, and acres of marble came off B deck to be replaced by artificial paneling. Wicker chairs were introduced as well. The only decorative item to remain untouched was the eagle up on the bow, but a hurricane off Cherbourg in 1913 took care of that. A giant wave swept over the bow, tearing off the creature's right wing. The rest of the carcass was removed and never replaced. Albert Ballin's second ship was the Vaterland, launched safely without anchors. On these new German ships, Ballin upgraded accommodations for steerage passengers. Although thousands of his humblest clients never saw the Ritz-Carlton or squash court or swimming bath, they were the most consistently profitable passengers. It was, in fact, the vast westward hegira of immigrants that dictated the enormous size of North Atlantic liners. Before Berlin improved condition, immigrants crossed rather bleakly. This is steerage quarters on La Lorraine, a turn-of-the-century French vessel. The modest little shelf with its straw mattress was, in addition to a bunk, the passenger's chair, closet, bureau, and desk. A nearby table offered indifferent food, where, had he not been clever enough to bring his own cutlery, the passenger might rent it for the crossing. No attempt was made to finish or disguise the naked steel walls of the ship. Up on deck, immigrants crowded together on the hatch covers when the weather was fair and often when it was not. In New York Harbor, vessels carrying immigrants would list as railings along the port side were packed for a glimpse of the legendary Statue of Liberty. Before they boarded, and after they landed, each immigrant was closely inspected for trachoma, the dread eye disease that Napoleon's soldiers had brought back to Europe after the Egyptian campaign. Any immigrant suffering from trachoma was automatically barred from entry into the United States. Berlin decided to upgrade steerage. With millions of prospective passengers, it was a shrewd decision. To begin with, he called it third class instead of steerage. Immigrants were housed in villages along the Elbe, awaiting passage, and were taken by special tenders to the ship. Here, a consignment of third-class passengers boards the new Imperator. Below, they would eat in a proper dining room, waited on by stewards with napkins over their arms. In the modest third-class kitchen, food for over 1,700 passengers was prepared thrice daily. On deck, there was more space and, a lesson learned tragically from the Titanic disaster, a seat for each in a bright red lifeboat. Red boats were easier to spot on a rough ocean. The Imperator holds the Atlantic record for numbers of souls carried on a peacetime crossing, in excess of 5,000 passengers and crew. Landing at Hoboken, passengers from the three classes on board the Imperator lined the wedding cake layers of the ship's forward deckhouse. Third-class deck space, expendable as usual, has been given over to house the luggage of the first and second class. Huge, listing, yet magnificent, this first of the Kaiser's trio of superliners was a memorable ship, and in the 2 years she sailed prior to 1914, she carried thousands of passengers, rich and wretched, between the old world and new. War broke out in August of 1914. And most of the great express liners were instantly converted into giant armed merchantmen. The Aquitania, Cunard's companion ship for the Lusitania and Mauretania, had just entered service the year before. Now she was returned to her fitting-out berth at Liverpool, while 5-inch guns were installed on her after end. But it took only a few months to convince the Admiralty that high-speed ocean liners consume ruinous amounts of coal. The ships were speedily demobilized, held in reserve for the job for which they had been designed, the transportation of large numbers of passengers at high speed. The war gave the North Atlantic liners a new look. An artist employed by the Admiralty, Norman Wilkinson, devised a scheme of camouflage known as Dazzle Painting. Conventional silhouettes were broken up into bizarre patterns and colors, designed to confuse enemy commanders as to the size and course of their quarry. There's no indication that dazzle painting ever really worked, but it was an inexpensive means of reassuring the ship's wartime crews and passengers. These new clients were soldiers, in their thousands, bound either for the trenches from America or, tragically, returning home from the Dardanelles as wounded. The Olympic, Mauretania, and France all saw service in the Mediterranean on this vital work. Designated specifically as hospital ships, the liners were painted white, their hulls sporting a green band interspersed with red crosses. Only the medical staff were accommodated in cabins. The wounded were carried in public rooms on the upper decks to make it easier to evacuate them in the event of an emergency. Bunks lined the promenade decks of the France. The Aquitania's handsome Palladian lounge, that would be used as a cinema in the 20s and 30s, became a hospital ward for the wounded men of World War I. A new vessel, completed too late for peacetime, was also pressed into service as a hospital ship. She was the third of the Olympic class, the Britannic. Originally, she was to have been called the Gigantic, but after the loss of the Titanic, White Star's management lowered their sights and used the more prosaic Britannic instead. Incorporating into her were all the lessons learned from the Titanic. Her hull was doubled right up past the waterline, and enormous gantry davits, grouped around funnels 1 and 4, could lower triple stacks of lifeboats over either side of the vessel. But she proved no luckier than her predecessor. On her third trip out to the Dardanelles, she struck a mine in the Aegean and went to the bottom in an hour. Luckily, she was carrying no wounded, and only 24 lives were lost. At the time of her sinking, she was the largest ship in the world. Of all the great White Star trio, only the Olympic was to survive. Also lost was the Lusitania, shown here in an eerily prophetic photograph taken in 1911 off the southern tip of Ireland, called the Old Head of Kinsale. At exactly this location 4 years later, carrying civilians eastbound to Liverpool, she was struck by a single German torpedo. It was an international outrage that is popularly supposed to have brought America into the war. In fact, President Wilson didn't declare war for 2 years. But the wanton destruction of a liner carrying non-combatants brought the impact of total war home to not only the victims and their relatives, but all the Allies as well. After the armistice in November of 1918, the British discovered the third of the Hamburg-America trio, the Bismarck, tied up in Hamburg harbor. She was a semi-derelict. The war had interrupted her fitting out, and many of her internal fixtures had been pirated for their precious metals. Under the terms of the peace treaty, she was awarded to the White Star Line as a replacement, ostensibly for the lost Britannic. By 1922, she had been completed at the expense of Blohm & Voss, her German builders. A White Star Line prize crew crossed the North Sea and sailed her back to Southampton. Once there, it took only paint crews half a day to put a black band around the tops of her 3 buff funnels to turn her into the Majestic. The Imperator was handed over as well, first to the United States as the USS Imperator to carry doughboys home. Afterwards, she was awarded to Cunard as a replacement for the Lusitania. Cunard rechristened her the Berengaria, the first Cunarder named after a queen. Queen Berengaria had been the wife of King Richard the Lionhearted. At Hoboken, the Vaterland was seized the day that war was declared on Germany, and at the suggestion of Mrs. Wilson, the First Lady, renamed Leviathan. So the war ended. The great irony was that although Germany had lost the war, the Kaiser's trio of superliners had survived intact. But they did not survive the Treaty of Versailles. All 3 were handed over to the victors as prizes of war. Peacetime brought an abrupt change in passenger traffic on the North Atlantic. In 1920, Congress passed the Dillingham Immigration Restriction Act, cutting off the hordes of immigrants who had filled the ship's humblest quarters. Deprived of their most profitable clients, the steamship companies lured a new mass passenger instead, American tourists. Former immigrant space was dressed up, just like this modest little cabin for 4 on the SS Albert Berlin. A coat of paint, a company bedspread, and presto changeo, a new class, tourist third cabin. It had something for everyone. Tourist implied travel and adventure, third promised economy, and cabin added a stamp of respectability. It was a shrewd marketing move and immensely popular, appealing to college students, middle and even working class Americans who were suddenly enabled to cross the Atlantic inexpensively. It was scarcely luxurious. Passengers who were absolute strangers slept head-to-head in upper and lower berths. There was 1 faucet, probably cold, 4 very thin towels, baths by appointment only, 1 spiky potted palm, and a tatty carpet stool. Nevertheless, it all worked. Tourist third cabin became almost chic, and was known popularly as the white-collar steerage. And for the first time, overwhelming numbers of Americans traveled eastbound on the North Atlantic. Thanks to tourist third cabin, 80% of the traffic was American, a proportion that has remained in effect to this day. Publicity was not very sophisticated. This White Star advertisement shows a pair of first-class passengers taking their ease before Mevez's manorial smoking room chimney on the Majestic. But the photographer has illuminated the scene with such a stunning display of firelight that he has revealed the scuffed work shoes and turned-up trousers of his passengers. They're no more than off-duty stewards serving as models. But no one seemed to care, and the great ships were booked heavily. It was known as the Atlantic Ferry, a year-round business in fair weather or foul, and it was mostly foul. The Majestic departed New York on a cold January evening. There are 2 inches of slush underfoot, and a menacing winter sky gives promise of unpleasant conditions once she has cleared the Narrows. This was no fair-weather cruise. It was, quite literally, the only way to cross. Air service would not begin for 2 decades. Passengers who were afraid of the sea or subject to motion sickness never risked a winter crossing at all. Here is a typical deck scene, a photograph taken on board the Mauretania before World War I. Apart from the difference in clothes, it might have been taken yesterday. For what we do on board ship today is precisely what our parents and grandparents did in years past. The group by the smoking room windows is exchanging ship's gossip. Who won the mileage pool, perhaps, or who was seen with whom last night in the lounge. Approaching are a pair of boat deck hazards, the walkers. We tend to have joggers today, but the walkers are of the same breed. 5 times around the Mauretania's deck was a mile, and purists used to carry 5 coins in a right-hand pocket, transferring them one by one to the left each time they swung past the veranda cafe at the stern. They walked on, regardless that they have just disrupted a shuffleboard game, or that the reverberations of their stout walking shoes might awaken late-morning occupants of cabins nearby. And in the lifeboat, Cunard crewmen continue their rounds of ceaseless maintenance that kept those Western Ocean mailboats in such spotless condition. So passenger life on any ship of any period tends to be similar, whether it was a game of deck tennis on the after-decks of the Aquitania or deck tennis on the boat deck of the Majestic. A young passenger dressed in a sailor suit exchanges a word with a crewman similarly dressed. There were boxing matches on the Berengaria. These same gloves were used by the Berengaria's most famous passenger in the 20s, the young Prince of Wales, who crossed twice in the course of an American visit, tactfully patronizing Cunard westbound and the White Star Line eastbound. On the Imperator before World War I, a children's stewardess supervises a group of first-class passengers. There was also a sandbox that deck stewards learned to loathe, for they had to sweep sand off the decks each evening. But for adults, there were almost too many games, perhaps dating from the time when German companies tried convincing their seasick passengers that violent exercise might make them feel better. The idea, too, was to provide facilities in mid-ocean that duplicated those to be found on either shore. Shuffleboard, based on an original game called Shuffleboard, is the granddaddy of all seagoing deck sports and was played on every ship. On the France, le bowling was offered, although how many strikes could be expected on a vessel that rolled so abominably is hard to envision. Skeet shooting occupied the gentlemen, but ladies were perfectly willing to lend their hand in a tug-of-war. Large ships could do justice to more elaborate games. There was a full-size tennis court between the funnels of the Normandy. French ships had other activities as well, particularly for thirsty Americans who, eastbound, were fleeing the strictures of prohibition. On the Lafayette, bellboys were given lessons for key English phrases. Good morning, sir. Where is the bar? And how to pronounce essential like dry martini in Manhattan. But there was also miniature golf on the Ile-de-France, or, for the more athletically inclined, fun below decks in the Rotterdam's pool, either swimming races or bathing suit competitions, or both. For the sedentary, there were deck chairs, to which obliging stewards brought tea trays every afternoon on the Berengaria. Afternoon tea was a little warmer, under cover of the Ile-de-France's promenade deck. But the true deck chair aficionados felt that they belonged out of doors, facing the elements, bundled up in what was called a steamer rug. It was almost impossible not to strike up a conversation with one's neighbor, similarly shrouded, and professional gamblers who worked the liners knew this well. The moment they boarded, they would bribe deck stewards for deck chairs near rich, unaccompanied male passengers, thereby initiating a chance encounter that would lead inevitably to some ruinous card games. Dogs were taken on board, in the old days put in charge of the ship's butcher. On the Queen Mary, There were specially constructed kennels up on the sports deck, and bellboys used to walk them daily. On the Aquitania in 1933, there was even a dog show. There was dancing at tea and after dinner in the lounge of the Majestic. If there was a shortage of dancing partners for young ladies of the first class, pursers used to recruit discreetly in the second or even tourist third cabin for presentable undergraduates who had been clever enough to bring along a dinner jacket, that vital passport to upward mobility on board ship. Sometimes near port, there was dancing on the deck, too. Passengers on the Aquitania, as she heads up towards the Narrows early one summer morning, share one last dance, although suited and hatted for disembarkation. These white flannel trousers sum up in one evocative image the carefree delights of a crossing. There were children's costume parties in the Berengaria's dining room at Christmas time, and costume parties for grown-ups on every ship. These entrants have borrowed a steward's tea trolley and turned it into an ice cream wagon. In later years on American ships, grown-ups disliked dressing up, and the vestigial remnant of transatlantic fancy dress on the United States was the funny hat competition. One here by a rather lazy woman who has merely inverted a Bergdorf Goodman's hat box and dressed it up with flowers. But in the old days, members of the Atlantic Conference, a self-regulating organization of all the shipping companies, forbade any cabaret on board their ships at all, so that passenger entertainment was largely a matter of home-brewed fun, traditionally games, quizzes, competition, amateur concerts, and the like. Passengers were summoned to meals on board British ships by a bugler. Here is the Megantic bugler posing for the photographer on deck in New York. The roast beef of Old England would be played to summon both sittings to dinner. Prior to the bugle, a boy in buttons would parade up and down the corridors, thundering on a large Chinese gong, the signal for first-class passengers to struggle into evening dress and black tie. When it was the only way to cross, celebrities were included on the passenger list of every crossing. Here are Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, happy on the Olympic, as the White Star caption puts it. Fairbanks was also happy later on the New Amsterdam. Dorothy Parker enjoyed the Normandy, and Elmo Pickerel, the Leviathan's wireless operator, used to pose his celebrated passengers next to a life ring. Among them, the ballet dancer Pavlova with her Boston Bull, as well as a dapper Yasha Heifetz. Jackie Coogan was a famous passenger in the 30s. When ships entered New York Harbor, a tug full of reporters and photographers would board down off Staten Island, and after some liquid refreshment offered by the obliging purser, would roam the ship for an hour while she steamed up to the piers, hunting out a celebrity or two to pose for the afternoon editions. Two such VIPs were this pair, not Alvin Karpis or Ma Barker, but Sir Noel Coward and his mother, arriving on the Olympic in the late 20s and dragged out on deck for a too-early morning photograph in front of the smoking room door. Sir Noel was kind enough to give me permission to use his photograph sight unseen from Lausanne, where he was living in retirement. I think if he had seen it, it might have hastened him into an earlier grave. At the end of a westbound crossing on the New York piers, passengers submitted to the ordeal of passing through U.S. customs. Although the photographer subconsciously has cut off the heads of the inspectors, he has left intact the evocative spectacle of a disgruntled passenger rooting through his trunk for some queried purchase, while his wife, no help at all, laughs in the background. Across the ocean, Southampton during almost any day in the 20s and 30s might look like this. 3- and 4-funnel silhouettes from pre-World War I that for generations of schoolboys, illustrators and travelers signified the lure of an ocean